Picture this. A roar erupts from 50,000 bloodthirsty spectators as two men face each other in the blazing sun, knowing that only one might leave the arena alive. This is the world of Roman gladiators, where death was entertainment and survival was a daily gamble with the gods themselves. For centuries, we've romanticized these warriors of the sand, imagining noble heroes fighting for glory and honor. But the brutal reality was far more savage, far more complex, and infinitely more terrifying than Hollywood could ever portray. Today, we're tearing away the myths to expose the genuine horror of what it meant to be a gladiator in ancient Rome. The story begins not with honor, but with death itself. The very first gladiatorial contests weren't entertainment at all. They were human sacrifices. In 264 BCE, 3 pairs of slaves were forced to slaughter each other at the funeral of a Roman aristocrat named Decimus Junius Brutus Pera. The Romans believed that spilling human blood would appease the spirits of the dead and ensure safe passage to the afterlife. Think about that for a moment. These games, which would eventually captivate an entire empire, started as ritualistic murder disguised as religious ceremony. But what began as occasional funeral rites quickly transformed into something far more sinister. Wealthy Romans discovered that sponsoring these blood spectacles was the ultimate political weapon. The more elaborate and deadly your games, the more the masses loved you. Politicians would bankrupt themselves, putting on increasingly savage displays, spending fortunes equivalent to millions of modern dollars just to watch human beings tear each other apart for votes. Now here's where the story gets truly disturbing. Who exactly were these gladiators forced to die for Roman entertainment? The popular image shows brave volunteers seeking glory, but the reality was far darker. The vast majority were slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals who had absolutely no choice in their fate. Imagine being captured in battle, dragged hundreds of miles from your homeland, and then told you must learn to kill other human beings or die yourself. These weren't just random acts of violence either. The Romans turned murder into an art form, creating an entire industry built on human suffering. Gladiatorial schools called ludi operated like factories of death, systematically training men to become killing machines. The most famous of these, the ludus magnus in Rome, could house over 2,000 gladiators at once. Picture a massive complex where thousands of men lived in barracks, knowing that their daily training was preparation for their own potential execution. Life inside these schools was a nightmare of discipline and brutality. Gladiators were fed a specific diet, heavy in barley and legumes, earning them the degrading nickname barley men, because this was food considered fit only for animals and slaves. This diet served a horrifying purpose. It helped them develop a layer of fat under their skin that would make sword cuts less immediately fatal, prolonging the agony and spectacle for the crowd's entertainment. The training itself was relentless and specialized. Gladiators didn't just learn to fight, they learned to die entertainingly. Every movement, every technique was designed not for quick, efficient killing, but for maximum visual impact. They practiced with wooden swords against posts for hours, building the muscle memory that might keep them alive for just one more fight. But perhaps the most chilling aspect was the variety of ways Romans invented for people to kill each other. They created dozens of different gladiator types, each with unique weapons and armor, specifically designed to create interesting and prolonged combat. The retiarius carried only a net and trident, relying on speed and agility while wearing almost no protection. The murmillo was heavily armored with a large shield and sword. The psychological torture of knowing you might face any number of different fighting styles, each requiring different survival strategies, must have been overwhelming. Consider the secutor, whose smooth helmet was specifically designed to fight the net-wielding retiarius. Every piece of their equipment was engineered to create a particular type of deadly spectacle. Romans didn't want quick deaths. They wanted drama, suspense, and prolonged suffering that would keep the audience on the edge of their seats. The games themselves were day-long festivals of death that began with elaborate processions and animal hunts. But the true horror was reserved for midday, when condemned criminals were executed in increasingly creative and brutal ways. Public executions were treated as lunchtime entertainment, with criminals sometimes forced to reenact mythological deaths, being burned alive as Hercules or torn apart by wild animals as Orpheus. Only after this appetizer of human suffering would the main event begin: gladiator versus gladiator. The crowd didn't just watch passively. They actively participated in deciding who lived and who died. Imagine the psychological torment of having your life decided by the bloodlust of strangers who saw you as nothing more than entertainment. The moment of death itself was ritualized and savage. A defeated gladiator was expected to die well, meaning without crying out or begging for mercy. The winner would deliver the fatal blow, often to the neck or throat, while thousands cheered. Archaeological evidence from gladiator cemeteries shows the brutal reality of these deaths, with skulls bearing evidence of devastating wounds from swords, spears, and other weapons. What happened after death was equally horrifying and revealed the depths of Roman cruelty. Gladiators who died honorably might have their bodies carried out with some dignity, but those who died disgracefully or were merely condemned criminals faced ultimate humiliation. Their bodies were often stripped, mutilated, and disposed of without proper burial rites. Some Christian writers describe officials dressed as gods of the underworld striking corpses with mallets to confirm death, turning even the moment after death into theatrical spectacle. The economics of this human suffering were staggering. A single gladiatorial show could cost the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of modern dollars. Gladiators were expensive investments, with their owners, called lanistae, charging enormous fees if their property was killed in the arena. This created a perverse incentive system where human lives were literally calculated in terms of rental fees and replacement costs. The average gladiator died around age 27, with many not surviving past their early 20s. Think about that statistic for a moment. These were young men, many barely adults, whose lives were systematically ended for public entertainment. Studies of gladiator remains show that defeated fighters had roughly a 1 in 4 chance of being killed, meaning that every time they entered the arena, they were essentially playing Russian roulette with their lives. Yet perhaps the most disturbing aspect of gladiatorial culture was how it pervaded Roman society. Gladiators became celebrities, their images appearing on household items, their victories celebrated in graffiti. Children played with gladiator toys. Women wrote love letters to famous fighters. An entire civilization became so desensitized to ritualized murder that it became their favorite form of entertainment. Some gladiators, if they survived long enough, could potentially earn their freedom after about 3 years of fighting. But this hope was itself a form of psychological torture. Imagine being told that if you can just kill enough other human beings, if you can just survive enough attempts on your own life, you might someday be free. Most never lived to see that freedom, dying in the sand while crowds cheered their final moments. The sheer scale of this human destruction is almost incomprehensible. Rome's Colosseum alone could hold 50,000 spectators, and games were held regularly throughout the empire. Conservative estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of gladiators died in arenas across the Roman world over the centuries these games were popular. We're talking about a systematic program of human sacrifice disguised as entertainment that lasted for over 400 years. Even the end of gladiatorial games reveals their savage nature. They weren't abolished because Romans suddenly developed compassion, but because the rise of Christianity condemned the pagan rituals associated with the games, and because emperors wanted to control the massive political power that came with sponsoring them. The last recorded gladiatorial contest in Rome occurred in 404 CE, marking the end of an era defined by its institutionalized brutality. The savage fate of Roman gladiators wasn't just about individual deaths in the arena. It was about an entire civilization that built its entertainment industry on systematic human suffering, that turned murder into art, and that created elaborate rituals around watching people die. These weren't noble warriors choosing their destiny. They were mostly slaves and prisoners forced into a system designed to kill them as spectacularly as possible. while generating maximum profit and political advantage for their masters. Understanding the true horror of gladiatorial games forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and civilization itself. Rome, the empire that gave us law, engineering, and literature, simultaneously created the most sophisticated system of ritualized murder in human history. Yet beneath the surface glamour of celebrity status lay a horrifying truth about what Roman society truly thought of these fighters. Despite their fame, gladiators remained branded with infamia, a legal and social stigma that marked them as fundamentally dishonored. They couldn't vote, serve in the military, or marry freeborn citizens. Women who consorted with gladiators risked losing their inheritance and social standing. Even successful gladiators who achieved wealth and recognition remained outcasts, celebrated one moment and scorned the next. The economics of gladiator life revealed the cold calculation behind the spectacle. Each gladiator represented a significant financial investment, with their market value fluctuating based on skill, experience, and drawing power. A novice gladiator might be worth the equivalent of a modest home, while a seasoned veteran could command prices rivaling luxury estates. This commodification meant that gladiators existed in a bizarre limbo, simultaneously precious assets and expendable entertainment. Training regimens were designed not just for combat effectiveness, but for visual appeal. Gladiators were fed a diet heavy in barley and legumes, earning them the nickname hordeari, or barley men. This diet wasn't chosen for optimal health, but because it created a layer of subcutaneous fat that made wounds more visible and dramatic, while potentially offering slight protection against cuts. The Romans literally engineered their fighters' bodies to bleed better for the audience's entertainment. The psychological toll was immense. Gladiators lived in constant awareness that each fight could be their last, creating a unique form of mental torture. They formed intense bonds within their familia gladiatoria, knowing that they might be forced to kill their closest friends in the arena. Some gladiators developed what we might recognize today as severe PTSD, documented in ancient sources describing fighters who became withdrawn, violent outside the arena, or who suffered from what Romans called melancholia. The savagery extended beyond the fights themselves into elaborate pre-death rituals. Before fatal blows were delivered, defeated gladiators were expected to perform their final moments according to strict protocols. They had to present their throat or chest to their opponent in a prescribed manner, maintaining dignity even in death. Those who begged, cried, or tried to flee were subjected to additional humiliation. The crowd would jeer and throw objects at gladiators who didn't die according to expectations. Post-mortem treatment revealed the depths of Roman cruelty. While honored gladiators might receive proper burial, many corpses were subjected to ritualistic degradation. Bodies were dragged around the arena by hooks, stripped of any valuable equipment, and sometimes fed to wild animals as part of the entertainment. The blood-soaked sand wasn't cleaned between fights, but was considered part of the spectacle, with later combatants literally fighting on the remains of earlier victims. The sexual exploitation of gladiators added another layer of degradation. Both male and female gladiators were often forced into prostitution, their supposed celebrity status making them desirable commodities in Rome's sex trade. Gladiator brothels operated near training schools, and successful fighters were sometimes rented out for private parties where sexual services were expected alongside combat demonstrations. Female gladiators, called gladiatrices, faced particular horrors. Beyond the standard brutality of combat, they were subjected to additional humiliation as their fights were often sexualized spectacles. They might be forced to fight naked or in minimal clothing, and their combats were frequently paired with crude commentary about their bodies. The rarity of female gladiators made them exotic attractions, leading to even more extreme and degrading scenarios designed to titillate audiences. The recruitment methods for gladiators revealed systematic human trafficking on an industrial scale. Roman armies would capture prisoners specifically to feed the gladiatorial system, with military commanders factoring potential gladiator sales into their campaign economics. Slave traders developed specialized networks for identifying and transporting potential fighters, creating a pipeline of human misery that stretched across the empire. Children weren't spared from this system. Young boys and girls were often sold into gladiatorial schools where they endured years of abuse disguised as training. Many never survived to see actual combat, dying from training injuries, malnutrition, or suicide. Those who did reach fighting age were psychologically broken, having known nothing but violence and exploitation their entire lives. The medical treatment of gladiators was advanced for its time, but not out of compassion. Roman physicians developed sophisticated surgical techniques specifically to keep gladiators alive and fighting longer. They could perform complex operations to repair wounds that would normally be fatal, but the goal was always to return fighters to the arena as quickly as possible. Pain management was minimal, as suffering was considered part of the gladiator's expected endurance. The betting culture surrounding gladiatorial games created additional pressure and corruption. Wealthy Romans would wager enormous sums on fights, leading to match fixing, poisoning of gladiators, and bribery of referees. Some gladiators were forced to lose fights to pay off their owners' debts, while others were given drugs or had their food tampered with to influence outcomes. The corruption ran so deep that emperors had to create special oversight positions to monitor the integrity of the games. Regional variations in gladiatorial practices often made the standard Roman games seem merciful by comparison. In some provinces, gladiators were forced to fight with deliberately sabotaged equipment, or in scenarios designed to guarantee death regardless of skill. Certain festivals featured mass executions disguised as gladiatorial combat, where condemned prisoners were given weapons but no training and forced to fight professional gladiators in predetermined slaughters. The psychological impact on spectators was profound and disturbing. Regular attendance at gladiatorial games created a population desensitized to extreme violence, with documented cases of spectators becoming aroused by bloodshed or developing addictive behaviors around watching death. Roman writers noted how children who attended games often became more violent and cruel in their daily lives, suggesting that the brutality was creating a cycle of societal sadism. The religious aspects of gladiatorial games revealed how Romans had corrupted spiritual practices into entertainment. What began as funeral rites to honor the dead became elaborate death worship, with audiences literally consuming the spiritual energy of dying gladiators. Some spectators believed that drinking gladiator blood could cure epilepsy, or that possessing items touched by dying fighters would bring luck or power. Even the architecture of amphitheaters was designed to maximize psychological trauma. The underground areas beneath arenas were deliberate chambers of terror, where gladiators waited in darkness listening to the sounds of combat above. Intricate pulley systems could suddenly lift wild animals or armed opponents into the arena without warning, creating an atmosphere of constant dread and unpredictability. The end of gladiatorial games didn't come from moral awakening, but from practical concerns. The constant demand for fighters was literally depleting the empire's human resources, while the enormous costs were bankrupting even wealthy sponsors. Christianity's influence was significant, but the economic unsustainability of the system was equally important in its eventual collapse. The legacy of gladiatorial games extended far beyond their official end, establishing patterns of institutionalized violence and entertainment that would echo through history. As we've seen, the gladiatorial games were far more than simple entertainment. They were a complex web of politics, economics, and social control that revealed the darkest aspects of Roman civilization. But what happened when this system finally began to crumble? The end of gladiatorial combat wasn't sudden. It was a slow, agonizing death that mirrored the brutal spectacles themselves. The economic reality of maintaining this blood-soaked industry became increasingly unsustainable as the Roman Empire faced mounting pressures. The cost of staging elaborate games had spiraled beyond reason, with some emperors spending the equivalent of millions of modern dollars on single events. Marcus Aurelius attempted to cap gladiator prices, recognizing that provincial elites were bankrupting themselves in pursuit of political favor. The financial burden was crushing entire regions, as local magistrates competed to outdo each other with increasingly expensive spectacles. Meanwhile, the supply of gladiators was becoming problematic. The empire's expansion had slowed, meaning fewer prisoners of war to feed into the system. The breeding programs in gladiatorial schools couldn't keep pace with demand, especially as mortality rates remained devastatingly high. Training a skilled gladiator required years of investment, only to watch that investment potentially die in minutes on the sand. The mathematics of human commodity trading were failing. The rise of Christianity fundamentally challenged the moral foundation of the games. Early Christian writers like Tertullian and Augustine condemned the spectacles as pagan rituals that corrupted the soul. They argued that watching humans die for entertainment was incompatible with Christian values of compassion and human dignity. As Christianity gained influence, particularly after Constantine's conversion in the early 4th century, the religious justification for gladiatorial combat began to evaporate. Emperor Constantine himself issued the first major decree against gladiatorial games in 325 CE, though enforcement was sporadic and the games continued in many regions. The Christian Church used its growing influence to pressure local officials to abandon the practice. Bishops refused to give communion to those who attended the games, creating social pressure that gradually eroded public support. Yet the games died hard because they served too many purposes beyond mere entertainment. They were a release valve for social tensions, a way for the masses to experience vicarious power over life and death. They reinforced social hierarchies by demonstrating what happened to those who challenged Roman authority. The ruling class used them to display wealth and gain political support. Breaking this cycle required more than moral arguments. It demanded fundamental changes to Roman society itself. The final gladiatorial contests were pale shadows of their former grandeur. By the late 4th century, many games featured condemned criminals rather than trained gladiators, reducing the spectacle to mere execution. The elaborate pageantry, diverse fighting styles, and skilled combat that had once captivated audiences gave way to crude bloodletting that satisfied neither the crowd's desire for entertainment nor the political elite's need for impressive displays. Archaeological evidence reveals the gradual abandonment of amphitheaters across the empire. The Colosseum itself fell into disrepair, with its underground chambers flooded and its mechanisms for lifting animals and scenery into the arena left to rust. Local amphitheaters were converted to other uses or simply abandoned, their stones quarried for new construction projects. The infrastructure of death was literally being dismantled. The last recorded gladiatorial combat in Rome occurred in 404 CE, when the monk Telemachus reportedly leaped into the arena to stop a fight and was killed by the enraged crowd. Emperor Honorius used this incident to justify a final ban on gladiatorial games, though regional variations continued for several more decades. The symbolic power of a Christian martyr dying to end the games provided the moral authority needed to close this chapter of Roman history. But the cultural impact of gladiatorial combat couldn't be erased so easily. The psychological damage inflicted on Roman society by centuries of normalized violence had created a civilization comfortable with cruelty. The casual acceptance of human suffering as entertainment had infected Roman culture at every level. Even as the games ended, the underlying attitudes that made them possible persisted in other forms of institutionalized violence. The economic networks built around gladiatorial combat also took time to unravel. Gladiatorial schools became military training facilities or were simply abandoned. The craftsmen who made weapons and armor, the merchants who supplied exotic animals, the gamblers who bet on outcomes, the prostitutes who serviced crowds, entire industries had to find new purposes or disappear entirely. The end of the games meant economic disruption for thousands of people whose livelihoods depended on organized human suffering. Perhaps most tragically, the gladiators themselves faced an uncertain fate as their world collapsed around them. Some were freed as the schools closed, but freedom meant little without skills applicable to civilian life. Others were sold to private owners or absorbed into military units. Many simply disappeared from historical records, their fates as unknown as their origins had been. The very people whose suffering had entertained millions vanished into historical obscurity. The legacy of gladiatorial combat extends far beyond ancient Rome, serving as a chilling reminder of humanity's capacity for organized cruelty. The games demonstrated how entertainment could be weaponized to normalize violence, how economic incentives could perpetuate human suffering, and how political power could transform murder into public policy. They showed how entire societies could become complicit in systematic brutality by treating it as normal, even necessary. Modern parallels are uncomfortable but undeniable. Any society that commodifies human suffering for entertainment, that treats certain groups as disposable, or that uses spectacle to distract from deeper problems, echoes the Roman amphitheater. The gladiatorial games remind us that civilization is fragile, that moral progress is never guaranteed, and that the distance between entertainment and atrocity can be terrifyingly short. The savage fate of Roman gladiators wasn't just individual tragedy. It was collective moral failure on an unprecedented scale. For over 4 centuries, Roman civilization perfected the art of turning human death into public entertainment, creating an industry of suffering that corrupted everyone it touched. The gladiators died for our entertainment, but in watching them die, Roman society lost something essential about its own humanity. Their story serves as an eternal warning about the dangers of dehumanizing others, of accepting cruelty as normal, and of allowing entertainment to override empathy. The sand of the arena has long since blown away, but the lessons written in blood and tears remain as relevant today as they were 2 millennia ago. In remembering the savage fate of Roman gladiators, we honor not just their suffering, but our responsibility to ensure such systematic cruelty never again masquerades as civilization.